War Between Worlds, Chapter 20, Opportunity. Jen's story was an interesting one. She had spent 3 days on what she called the mini-cruiser with Technorg and Ta, putting their heads together with a few Galvans on the crew to rig up individual null-void teleporters for each of the Tokostars. You can sort of thank Grandma Verdona for the idea. It's similar to what she did to Ghost Freak. Ta shook her head. Glad I never met your grandmother. The story behind the evolved Vaxasaurian had come out quickly as well. Jen frowned. I think she technically is your grandma, too. I'm not entirely sure how the DNA matchup would work between us. Jen shrugged. Rook smiled. Once they'd figured out how to take down the Waybads, Jen had finally gotten through to Azimuth, who gave her the unlocking code for Incursion DNA and instructed her on how to use the lifeform lock function. He'd advised her not to go too long as one species that wasn't her natural one, though, as there was no telling what it might do. After that, she had infiltrated the Incursion forces and quickly made her way up the ranks to Atea's guard. It took a full week for things to get back to any kind of normal. It was especially weird because everyone was scrambling for a few holidays that had been sort of canceled under the Incursion rule. Christmas was set to be a more subdued affair than any other year, and Jen was slightly disappointed that Rook's first winter on Earth had been interrupted by the invasion. Most people spent Christmas at home with their families, celebrating the fact that their loved ones were still with them after everything that Earth had just been through. Jen supported that sentiment, but was determined that her partner not be left out, so she dragged him to her house and set him up in the guest room for his vacation. Patellidae insisted that those who had been involved in the rebellion, actively running for their lives during the invasion, take off until New Year's. So Jen decided that she would include her partner in her family traditions. There were a few traditions they couldn't indulge in. Going skating at the indoor rink in Bellwood. The rink was currently closed, as many other things were after the invasion, but they had a solution. Jen and Rook drove out to Max's secret fishing spot with her parents, followed by Gwen with Kevin and her parents. One transformation later, and Big Chill had frozen the lake enough for them to skate on it. Rook wasn't quite so sure on his ice skates as he was on his feet. Jen giggled as he tentatively took a few steps. She took his hands. Stop picking your feet up. It's not gonna help here. Do you trust me? Yes. He didn't hesitate, and she grinned at him. Good. She guided him out onto the ice. Kevin and Gwen watched the two of them skate across the ice, and Kevin grinned at Gwen.
They make a cute couple.
Gwen elbowed him lightly. They haven't actually asked each other out yet. Don't tease them.
Once they do, though, there's gonna be a lot of teasing,
Kevin said, nodding. Gwen snorted. A few days before New Year's, Jen approached Rook. I need a favor, she stated, leaning in the doorway of the downstairs guest room. Anything, he said, standing, setting down the history book she'd gotten him for Christmas. He hadn't had any idea what to get her. Her mother had helped him. He'd found her a limited edition Sumo Slammers action figure, though he'd admitted that he'd never actually seen the show, despite having played a few games based on it with Jen. Careful, I'll hold you to that, she said with a grin. I got a call from Lieutenant Steele this morning. There's going to be a party, an official gala, to ring in the new year with something positive. She sighed, stepping into the room. They're inviting a bunch of the plumbers and some delegates from other worlds, and they want me there.
For extra security?
Rook asked, a bit confused. Sort of. According to Steele, it's more of a publicity stunt. The hero of 100 worlds and all, they want me to be there to show that things on Earth are going back to normal. The extra security having the Omnitrix there provides is sort of just a bonus. Rook nodded, still frowning slightly.
What do you need from me?
I really don't want to go alone. I've only been to one super fancy party, and that was thrown by Captain Nemesis, and it was awful. I only knew one person there, and I didn't even know her well. It would just be nice to not be alone at this thing.
I can understand that. Is Carl Nesmith
not a villain? Jen nodded. He is. Wasn't always, but yeah, he's actually currently in jail. Not sure when he's getting out after 2 kidnapping charges. She frowned and shook her head. But the party, will you come with me? Rook nodded. Of course. I do not have Earth formal wear. I assume that as a guest, I should not wear my armor. Jen laughed lightly. No, but there's a tailor downtown. They should be able to get you fitted with something that'll work. My treat, since I'm dragging you to this. Or if you have formal wear from Ravana, you should wear that. Rook frowned. The formal wear on my homeworld is quite simple. Jen shrugged. So? All the alien delegates will be in their homeworld formal wear. The Queen of Laoda will be there, and their formal wear is literally a blue robe. Can't get much simpler than that. Rook nodded. Very well. And this is on New Year's Eve? Jen nodded. Yep. Parties from 8 to midnight. We'll be counting down to the new year in style. Rook shook his head, but smiled. That sounds like a lovely time. Jen grinned at him. He couldn't help the warm feeling that left in him. He had feared he'd never see that smile again. In all honesty, this invitation might be just what he was looking for. The opportunity to tell her how he felt. He would tell her at the party. He was resolved. He would not miss his chance again. Chapter 22. New Year, Old Faces. The next few days were a bit of a blur for both of them. Jen was whisked off by a professional stylist hired by one of the higher-ups, who'd asked Steele to see if she could be there. Rook pulled his formal robes from Ravana out of the back of his closet. He was lucky he'd changed his mind at the last minute and brought them, despite believing that he wouldn't need them. Normally it was just the magisters that were invited to events like this. He'd never considered that Jen, as a specialist, the hero of many beings across the universe, would be asked to come to affairs like this. He met Jen in the hangar where she parked. He blinked as she stepped out of her car. He'd never seen her dressed up like this. She wore a gown. It was nearly floor-length, sky blue with an iridescent overlay that shimmered green where the light hit it. Her hair, still chin-length, was elegantly curled, and there was a laurel made of what looked like forget-me-nots pinned expertly into her hair. As she stepped out of the car, he saw a pair of sky-blue flats that laced up her legs, disappearing under her skirt. The dress was sleeveless, save for what appeared to be a shawl made from the same iridescent fabric. She smiled at him. You look nice. I like the formal wear on Ravana. If Jen had to describe in Earth terms what the formal wear looked like, she would probably compare it to something in Eastern Asia. He looked a lot like a martial artist, but the robes were bright yellows and deep bronze-toned browns. You look like royalty. It was all he could think to say. She didn't look particularly comfortable in a dress. He'd never seen her wear one before. She preferred things she could fight in, boot-cut jeans and t-shirts. She blushed slightly. Thanks. It's a bit much, but it's kind of cute. She grinned, and blushed a bit deeper, but nodded slightly. We should get going. He nodded, and they both got into the car. Jen drove them out of town. The party was happening in Los Angeles, which wasn't too far of a drive. Jen took a deep breath as they pulled up, and Rook frowned as she pulled a set of keys out of her glove compartment. She shrugged. Valet won't have a plumber's badge. I don't pull them out often, but Kevin thinks these things through. Rook nodded as they pulled up in front of a large, well-lit building. He couldn't see much of it due to the throng of people out front, most with cameras. He frowned slightly. Jen let out a breath. Yeah, welcome to my world. The press never stops. You ready for this? He nodded. They stepped out of the car, and Jen handed the keys to a boy in uniform, who handed her a numbered slip of paper that she slipped into her purse. The boy took the car and drove away. Jen and Rook made their way down a red carpet that led into the building. Rook followed Jen's lead, feeling awkward beyond belief. It seemed that Jen shared this opinion as she let out a sigh of relief when they entered the building. And not a glimpse of harangue. Jen said, grinning slightly. Rook nodded.
He has not been doing well since he made a deal with the Incursions.
Jen nodded. All right, let's do this, she said, composing herself. He offered her his arm, and she smiled and took it, pink dusting her cheeks. They walked into the grand ballroom, and Rook blinked. It was lavishly decorated. A crystal chandelier hung overhead. There were tables set around an expansive dance floor. Beings already milled about, mostly human, but he spotted several aliens dotted through the crowd, and that relaxed Rook a little, made him feel less out of place. Jen handed her invitation to a man standing at a podium. He nodded, smiling slightly. Flipping her invitation, he read it and nodded, pulling a small microphone closer to himself. Jennifer Tennyson and Rook Blonko. Heads turned, and several of the aliens in the crowd bowed as the two of them made their way down the stairs. A man stepped up to them, a blonde dressed in formal military blues. He had a scar through one of his eyes. He saluted Jen and smiled. Miss Tennyson, good to see you here. Jen grinned and shook hands with him. Lieutenant Steele, this is my partner, Rook Blonko, agent of the plumbers. Rook, this is Lieutenant Steele, a member of Sect. Rook shook hands with the lieutenant. It is good to meet you, Rook said, and Lieutenant Steele nodded. You too. Listen, Jen, I know you're really only here as a favor, but please mingle. A lot of people are still worried about aliens on Earth after everything that's happened. No offense. Jen pulled a face at him. He shook his head. I'm just saying, you're sort of the poster child for human-alien relations. If we want this to go well, you're gonna be here all night. Jen sighed. How did you know I was planning to slip off early? She muttered. I called your cousin for advice, Steele stated matter-of-factly. Jen rolled her eyes. Smart. Fine, I'll mingle. Rook laughed lightly. I was unsure why you agreed to this. You only intended to show up and then leave? He, too, was speaking lowly. Jen blushed. Steele nodded. I should have called him. He seems to know you just as well as your cousin. Jen laughed and shook her head. Yeah, just about. Come on, let's go mingle. And mingle they did. They spoke with a few senators, delegates from several Earth countries, and representatives from the UN. There were actually quite a few representatives of other worlds there, too. The Queen of Luoda was there in her plain blue robes. She curtsied to Jen, and when Jen asked how her son was, she lit up with a smile. Apparently, the Tiffan was doing very well and wanted to come visit at some point. There was a representative from several other planets as well. Rook lost track after a while. Names and faces passed in a blur, and none of them seemed at all interested in who he was. He didn't blame them. He was hardly the hero of 100 worlds, but Jen never left him out, always being sure to introduce him. Jen was speaking to the ambassador from Sonarsa when she looked up and spotted someone across the room. She let him finish before she smiled. I'm sorry, Ambassador. I've just spotted someone I know, if you'll excuse me. He nodded, and Jen grabbed Rook's hand, pulling him through the crowd until they reached the table where a blonde girl sat. She was human, or looked it, wearing a white dress, long and simple but shimmering slightly. A black belt sat around her waist, echoed in a choker around her neck, and a band in her hair. She spotted Jen and grinned wide, standing and meeting her halfway with a hug. Eunice, it's so good to see you, the blonde laughed. It's good to see you too, Jen. It's been way too long. Jen turned to Rook with a giant grin on her face. Real this time, not the fake smile she'd been putting on for the last half hour or so for the delegates. Rook, this is Eunice, Azimuth's lab assistant. Eunice, this is Rook, my partner. Eunice grinned and shook hands with Rook. You were not on Galvin last time we were, Rook stated as they sat down at Eunice's table. She shook her head. No, Azimuth sent me somewhere safe. Jen nodded, seeming to know what Eunice was talking about. Rook raised an eyebrow at her, and she mouthed, later. They chatted for a few minutes before someone approached the table and bowed to Jen. She blinked. Al! I wasn't expecting to see you here. The Apollonite grinned at her, pink stars twinkling in marble skin.
I had hoped you would be here. Will you do me the honor of dancing with me?
Jen laughed and took his hand. I'd love to. He swept her out onto the dance floor, and Rook frowned slightly. Eunice tilted her head at him.
You like her, don't you?
Rook blinked, the fur on his face puffing up slightly.
Observation is most of my job, Rook. But she's also very special to me. We're practically family.
Rook frowned. Jen had never mentioned Eunice before.
I'm not human. I'm a prototype of the Omnitrix called the Unitrix.
Rook blinked.
What?
Eunice shrugged.
Originally, Azimuth wanted the Omnitrix to be self-sufficient. He decided against that later, but Jen and her friends found me and convinced Azimuth that he shouldn't lock me away again.
Rook was very confused as to why Eunice was telling him any of this.
She saved me. She saved a lot of people and she deserves to be happy. So what I'm saying is, if you can make her happy, please do.
She smiled at Rook, who nodded. He understood. Eunice wasn't threatening him. She was just looking out for her friend. They were interrupted when someone came to ask Eunice for a dance. Rook watched Jen dance with the Apollonite and frowned. He was a prince, at least according to what Rook had learned about the Apollonites in classes. He wore the deep pink sash over his toga that signified royalty. He looked away from the pair as Jen laughed at something the Apollonite had said. He frowned. Across the hall was a woman. She wouldn't have stood out, not in this crowd, if it wasn't for her eyes. They were bright pink, the way Gwen's were when she used her powers. But where the pink consumed Gwen's eyes, this woman had it only in her iris. Her hair was a pale blonde, so pale that it was almost white. Rook frowned and stood. Maybe it was Jen's paranoia rubbing off on him. Maybe it was the way she was staring at Jen and her dance partner, but something compelled him to cross the hall. By the time he reached the spot where she had been, she was gone. He blinked, looking around. He spotted her again at the doors that opened into the garden, slipping through them. He followed, still not sure why. There was no one else here. The courtyard was beautiful, red rose bushes spilling around the perimeter of the space. A fountain rested in its center, water spilling from a carved stone vase held in the hands of a carved woman in Grecian-style robes. The woman was here. In the light of the moon, her hair was no longer blonde, but a silvery white. She was dressed in black, with pink and purple accents. But the largest accessory she wore was a necklace. "You followed me." He frowned and stepped out of the shadows. He didn't know what to say. "I knew you would. You saw me looking at her." She turned, and she was toying with the pendant on her necklace, a large thing that looked as though it had been carved out of stone. It didn't really fit with the rest of her outfit, which was elegant and modern. She tilted her head at him. He spotted a wild gleam in her eyes. "You were looking too. She's hard not to look at. She's like the sun, beautiful, warm, but dangerous when you get close. Get too close and you may well get burned, but it's well worth the pain." The door behind Rook opened and he turned. Jen had followed him out without her dance partner. "You okay, Rook?" Rook looked back into the garden, but the woman was gone. "I am fine." Whoever she had been, she was right. It was hard to not look at Jen, even as she frowned at him. He looked back at the fountain. "There is something I have been wanting to tell you, and I think it is time I said what I need to say." Jen nodded. "Oh?" "Yes, and I would appreciate if you would simply listen until I am finished." She nodded. "I have been trying to figure out how to put my feelings into words for quite some time. I know we have not known each other for very long, but I have developed romantic feelings for you." She blinked at him. I understand if this makes you uncomfortable. If you wish, I will apply for a transfer.
No, I don't want you to transfer. She took a deep breath. There's a movie coming out on Saturday. I think you'd love it. If you want to come with me as a date. He blinked at her. She let out a soft laugh. You're not the only one with feelings here, Rook. He stepped over to her.
Blonko, if you wish, I would like you to call me by my chosen name.
Jen smiled. I'd like that too, Blonko. Looking at her smile at him as she intertwined their fingers, he could see what the woman had meant. It would be easy to get drawn into her orbit, to get burned by the light in those toxic green eyes, but it would be worth every minute.